Salutations and welcome to A Link Between Zeldas, Episode 3, a casual deep dive into the Legend of Zelda continuity. I'm your host, Hylian Andy, and welcome! I did it. I made it happen. 2 episodes within a week of each other. And they said it couldn't be done. Nobody told me it couldn't be done. But I'm sure my skeptics are out there somewhere, plotting, waiting for their moment for me to screw up again where I wait 8+ days or God forbid a month before another episode, but here we are. So today I'm going to be talking about something that is actually left over from what I talked about last week. So last week I went into this whole long, I'm going to call it a rampage. I was very negative on last week's episode about my overall thoughts towards Skyward Sword, and while I don't regret being that negative, especially considering how much I warned everybody I was going to be negative about it, and in certain areas of the game, there was definitely some stuff that I left out. I somehow completely forgot in all of my stupor to talk about anything to do with the dungeons, puzzles, and bosses, which, I mean, let's face it, most of us are playing the Zelda games for that. We're playing for the dungeons, for the puzzles. I know I am. I'm a puzzle guy. I love solving puzzles. I just got a Plague Tale Innocence in the mail today, and I'm very excited to play it because I've heard that it has a lot of puzzles. Well, Dan, game review guy from the Mana Bar podcast, has been telling me a lot about how many puzzles are in that game, so I'm really excited for that. So Skyward Sword, that is one area Skyward Sword nailed it on the head for me. Their puzzles were so inventive. And I actually jotted down a few, but I'm going to go into each temple in depth. And there were some mini areas or mini temples, but altogether there were 7 major temples in the game. 5 of the 7 of them are very unique. 2 of them I thought were lacking in a little bit, but all of them were very inventive with their puzzles. So that's the one thing I can safely say that Skyward Sword did nearly flawlessly. Not most of the dungeons didn't, again, the 5 of the 7 didn't feel like they were lazy. None of them necessarily felt like they were lazy. They were all designed very well, but not just from a design and puzzle and gameplay standpoint, but from an aesthetic standpoint as well. So the first one I want to go into, I'm just going to go in order of how they appeared in the game. The first one is Skyview Temple. And this is really something really cool I didn't know about when I was researching this. I didn't realize the music changed the deeper you got into the temple, which I think is really neat. I can't remember a Zelda game where that happened. I'm sure there were other dungeons. If anybody knows of any in particular where the music changes depending on how far you get in the dungeon, please let me know. I'd love to kind of have a list of all that because I think that's a really neat idea. Most of the games I can think of, sure, there are some where maybe the music might get a little louder the closer you get. Like I know at the end of Ocarina of Time when you're going up to fight Ganon, the organ music gets more and more loud and dramatic the higher you get up, but that's the only example I can think of off the top of my head. So I thought that was a really cool idea for the temple. There's a puzzle. So this temple, aesthetically, it was very like kind of like this underground, glowing, mossy feel to it. And there was one puzzle in particular that I feel like sort of represented Skyward Sword. It was the best representation of Skyward Sword because it used one of the worst mechanics in the game to do one of the most unique puzzles in the game. I was generally stumped quite a few times in this game, and, I do generally get stumped in most puzzle games at one point or another, but I'm always able to solve them without looking any up. It was true with this one. So you went into this little room where there's just this, like, stone eyeball, and as soon as you pull out your sword, the eye will open. When you sheath your sword, it will close, more or less signifying that you have to use your sword in some respect. I did not catch on to that right away. I was trying every sort of thing, because the Skyward Strike doesn't do anything. You can't shoot it. I believe you had the slingshot at that point, but you couldn't shoot it with a slingshot, where in most Zelda games, you see an eyeball, you shoot it with a slingshot or an arrow. That's just how it goes. This one, however, eventually, after going back and forth around the dungeon, I eventually, decided, no, this is the room that has the next puzzle. This has got to be the room that I have to solve right now. So I'm like looking, and I'm like, all right, it opens its eye when I pull out the sword. Okay, we got that far. Now what do we do? And I was just kind of waving my sword back and forth, and I'm like, oh, the eyeball is tracing my sword. It's tracing where the sword is going. That's very interesting. So I kind of just kept moving it around, and it made the eyeball dizzy, which made it, I forget if it made it weak enough for me to shoot or if it just rescinded into its eye socket and that was the solution of the puzzle. But that was so unique. That was one of the most unique puzzles I've ever seen in a Zelda game. And the reason I say it's the best representation of the game is because it's the most unique thing, and you're using the, Wii Motion Plus and the sword tracking to do it. And, the sword tracking isn't necessarily the worst mechanic in the game, especially when you have to do it so slow. But the game mechanics were the issue with the game, and the puzzles were not. That's why I say it's the best representation of the game, because here you have the two in tandem. So this room, to me, is the best representation of Skyward Sword, and there wasn't really much else to say about this temple. It was the tutorial temple. This is where you learn how to cut spider webs, how to fight skull. I can't remember if they were Skulltulas in this one or not, but the spiders were there. And in the end, you only end up fighting Girahim for the first time. One of, I believe, 3 or 4 times you have to fight him. And I'll get into him a bit later, because you do fight him in a couple other temples. You get the beetle in this temple, which I've mentioned before, not necessarily my disdain for the beetle item, but for the fact that it's a lot of waiting and it's very slow moving. That being said, I actually give this item a lot of credit, because you use it in a lot of other areas outside the temple. Because Zelda items tend to go into those two categories. There's the items where they're very tropey, like, oh, you're really only using them for this one thing, and you're not using them anywhere else in the game, and they're not really useful anywhere else in the game. The one thing that always comes to my mind is that spinning gear top from Twilight Princess, which I loved that. I loved using it in that temple, and you could use it to solve a couple of puzzles outside, but it was mostly useless. I originally thought I could shield surf with it throughout Twilight Princess's overworld, but you can't do anything with it. It's basically useless. The beetle can be used. You use it a lot throughout the world, so I give it a lot of credit for that. Other than that, there wasn't really much to say about this temple in general. Something that comes up in every temple is the boss key mechanic. You basically get a shape. That's the best way I can describe it. Your key is a shape, and you have to use the motion controls of the Wiimote to fit it into the hole, which worked fine. I thought that was an interesting use of the motion controls. You do this in Breath of the Wild as well with some of the shrines. You have to take. It's kind of weird when you have you're taking the controller and you're doing it, but you have to take the controller and move it around. The only thing that sucks about it is you often have to reset it. It can't pick up that the Wiimote is just you can't just continuously move it around because the cord gets all kind of tangled and everything like that. So you have to constantly reset it almost. But still, that was a very interesting boss key. It's not just find a boss key, pop it in. You actually have to all right, how can I move this shape around to fit into this specific hole? So that was really neat, and that comes up in pretty much every temple. Other than that, there wasn't really much else to talk about. The next temple is the Earth Temple. Now, this one was very much hey, here's the Fire Element Temple, whereas the first one did the Skyview Temple did kind of hark back to that feel that you got maybe in the Forest Temple or the Deku Tree. Not exactly, but there was a lot of foliage inside. So this one, it even has the same name as the one from Ocarina of Time. But insert any fire temple here is basically how this one feels. I remember the Liz folks. I don't know if they're Lizzle foes. I always just called them Liz foes. The lizard army guys, the warriors. I remember they were kind of a pain because, again, I talked about this in the last episode where, at certain times I would resort to just swinging the sword wildly, and they would, I was able to dodge as many attacks as I could, but they were a real pain when it came to like hitting them incorrectly, and then I got frustrated with the combat really quickly, so they weren't good for me. The temple itself seems to take after from what I looked up, because each of the temples has a very unique feel to it, and this one takes after more of like a Mongolian temple, kind of a combination of Buddhist and Hindu iconography. I'm reading that. I did not, trust me, my vocab isn't that vast where I can just pull that word out of my butt. So when I saw it, I definitely got the kind of a Native American tribal feel from a little of it. I didn't, I wouldn't think Buddhist, Hindu, or Mongolian, but I guess that well, according to the Zelda wiki anyways, that was more of the inspiration for the temple. The temple itself was pretty forgettable, unfortunately. Like, you did have to roll around on this eyeball through the lava. And when I say forgettable, I don't mean it was bad. I just mean that out of all the temples, like, I'm like, oh, it's the fire temple. Moving on. Like, I didn't really remember it as like, oh, wow, that was amazing, or nothing really stuck out to me. With a lot of these temples, because I'd already played Skyward Sword all the way through before doing the podcast, a lot of these temples I went back and watched footage on YouTube. And yeah, aside from like rolling around on the eyeball through the lava, there's just like this giant boulder eyeball thing that you roll around in. Aside from that, nothing was really too memorable about it. You use the mole mitts that you get. I believe you get the mole mitts outside of the dungeon. I don't think you get them inside. But the mole mitts really just dig for treasure, and you can dig for these little spots where your arrow will shoot up through the ground. And that's about it. However, despite me not really remembering much about the temple, I do remember the boss to the temple, and I remember it was very... It reminded me of a classic Zelda villain. And I really don't know how to describe what I mean by that. But when I think of a lot of the other... when I say classic Zelda villain, I'm mostly talking about the 3D Zelda games. I feel like this guy really harked back to kind of the aesthetic. A lot of the Zelda villains always have something going on where... with the eyeballs, a lot of them do. Like, I remember I don't remember the name of any of the bosses. They always have like a weird name, but the one from the Deku Tree in Ocarina of Time is always the first thing I think of. It just has this one eyeball. And that's kind of what this guy reminded me of. And it's kind of this like lava spider that's trapped in a rock, and you're fighting. He comes out of a dragon's mouth, and you're kind of fighting on this like, it looks kind of like Great Wall of China style dragon back hill almost, and it was just really cool. And the more you damage it, the more the rock comes off, and it reveals like, with the one eyeball, and he's like this lava ball inside, and eventually you beat it. But I just remember, I'm like, oh, that just felt like classic Zelda to me. I'm not going to be able to say that about every boss on this list, but this one in particular gave me that feeling. It's an undescribable feeling, but it was one of those moments in Skyward Sword, especially in Skyward Sword with, again, I don't want to be as negative on this episode as I was in the last one, but it gave me that feeling that Skyward Sword at times really lacked. So that was really cool. Moving on to the Lanayru. Oh God, I always just said Lanayru mining facility, but there's a Y in there. So I don't know if it's Lanayru mining facility. So if I'm butchering any of these vocab proper nouns, just please bear with me. So I talked about how the Lanayru Desert in general was my least favorite portion, not from a game design perspective, but from a mechanics perspective, just because the enemies sucked. They were really hard considering what you were given with the controls. I forgot to mention the sand, the sinking sand. So here's another kind of classic, the stamina bar stupid. So rather than trying to come up with an inventive way to travel over the quicksand, you just have to find little spaces where you can just run over it really fast, and you always get right to the edge right when your stamina bar is running out. And it just seemed very pointless. Like, I just felt like there was probably something else you could have done with that. Like in Ocarina of Time, you get the boots that can walk on air, and you know it's just for a limited amount of time. And it's the same concept where you only have a certain amount of time to get across a certain area, but still, it's just that stupid stamina bar, and you just run forward. Just there's no real puzzle behind it. You're just running forward. You don't have to really achieve anything. Just run. Another thing was I had an issue with was the bombs. I forgot to mention this because in Lanayru Desert, in this temple, you have to sometimes use the bombs and roll them into things, and there were a lot of times where I went to roll a bomb, and as I was rolling the bomb, because the same motion, you just have to flick your sword, your Wiimote to take out the sword. Sometimes I would be trying to throw a bomb and it would take out my sword and hit the bomb. That was very frustrating. But said I wasn't going to be overly negative this time, so moving on from that. Something that's really awesome about this temple is you get introduced to the time stone mechanic. Well, you get introduced to it outside of the temple, but you have to use it inside the temple as well. And this was one of the most interesting designs in the game, was kind of going back and forth between past and present while in the temples, and you have to use that to solve the puzzles, because certain areas would be blocked off in the past but not the future, and vice versa. And I just thought that was really cool. And, it would make certain enemies come back alive, so you could kind of see, the carcasses of those Beamos. Ugh, I hated those guys. And you knew that when you hit the time shift stone, they would come back alive, and sometimes you'd have to have the time shift stone traveling towards a point. You'd kind of have to be, doing little, time trial stuff while it's doing that. That was just a very interesting mechanic they introduced. I forgot. This temple seemed like it took a long time for me, but I think that's just because I was really intricately exploring it when I probably didn't have to. Because going back and rewatching some other people do it on YouTube, I realized wow, that didn't really take all that long, did it? So yeah, this was the area where I hated the enemies, but the design was so gorgeous and vibrant. When you're in the present time, everything is really degraded and crumbled. But then when you hit the time shift stone and you go back into the past, everything is brand spanking new, very colorful, very vibrant. I loved that contrast between the two. I thought that was very good. Yes, I did hate the Beamos and the Armos. I hated both of them. They were really hard for me at certain points, especially the Beamos, because no matter the Beamos in Ocarina of Time, if you got a certain amount of time away, the beam would run out of not enough proximity, and it wouldn't kick you. These ones, no matter how far away or close up you were, there was no way you were avoiding that beam. And it was just very anyways. So you get the blowgun in this temple, and this reminds me a lot more of the gear top from Ocarina of Time, because you use it in this temple and a temple of equal aesthetic. But aside from that, the only thing you really use it for outside of this temple is to clean someone's house. In the temple, it's used very effectively. You clear sand, you spin certain pinwheels to do things, certain magnet spinnies to do things, depending on what you need to do. And it always worked rather well for what it needed to do. I didn't have a problem with the mechanics of the item. It's just it was just really useless outside of the temples. You just didn't do anything with it. It was just kind of like here's your, you know, a MacGuffin for the temple. And that's about it. So there's not really too much to say about that, unfortunately. The boss was this scorpion. Again, this one reminded me a lot of the Ocarina of Time Deku Tree boss. He's just the what I might bring him up a lot. He's just like, out of all of the bosses in Ocarina of Time, like maybe because it's the first boss you face, he's just the first one I think of, and it's like, for me, because that was the first Zelda I played, it's just synonymous with Zelda villains for me. And the scorpion kind of had the same thing. He had the eyes in his claws as well as in the middle of his head, and yeah, it's nothing really too fantastic about him. He burrowed under the sand. You had to blow the sand out of the way and then just hit the eyeballs. So again, he gave me that kind of Zelda boss feeling from like an aesthetic standpoint, but not necessarily from a mechanic standpoint, because he was kind of there, pretty easy. The next dungeon was the Ancient Cistern, and I'm going to be remembering more about the game as I go back into it, but I don't remember between the mining facility and the Ancient Cistern. I don't know how much game takes place between those two things, but for some reason the Ancient Cistern, or Cistern, I don't really know how to pronounce that either. I don't. In my mind, I always pictured it in the desert, but then when I was reading back up on it, I'm like, oh no, wait, that was in the woods. Okay, it's just weird because it has like this overall like sandstone look to it. It just reminded me of the desert so much that I thought that's where it was. But it's actually behind the waterfall in the woods. And going into water temples in general, I hear a lot of people who are usually complaining about water temples in Zelda games, or underwater levels in general, I guess, in video games. I can agree. I can understand. Oftentimes water levels are the bane of our existence because the mechanics are so off, especially in games a long time ago. Maybe not necessarily in games now. Like in this Zelda, I don't really think being in the water was really all that difficult. In fact, they even gave you this like kind of spin move to go through the water at some points, where it kind of made it a little easier, except it did use up the, stamina bar, but it was pretty easy to move through the water. It wasn't anything like, Mario 64 water level where it was like really clunky or anything like that. And water temples in general in the Zelda and water levels in general in the Zelda universe have never really affected me the way that it does other people. Like every time Ocarina of Time is brought up, people say like, oh my god, I love Ocarina of Time. I hated that water temple though. And I never used a player's guide on that water temple. Yeah, it's a little daunting at first in that one because you have to like, a lot like the level here, you have to change the levels of water. But I never really found that to be all that difficult. Sometimes it was time consuming, especially if it was your first time doing the level, because you'd have to kind of get used to like when to change the levels and how. But I didn't think it was any more or less difficult than any of the other levels in the games, in their respective games. I don't really remember much. Twilight Princess is going to be a game that I'm looking forward to going back to, because Twilight Princess I only played through once, but I don't really remember the Water Temple being all that difficult in that game either. So the Ancient Cistern is actually my favorite temple. It was the most memorable. Both the dungeon and the boss were the most memorable for me. I just thought it was such a cool temple. You learn the hard way not to go too close to the hands or they'll pound you. You get the whip in this game, which again was mostly a useless weapon. It was very useful in the dungeon, and I guess you do use it a bit outside of the temple, but I think it would be really cool. Maybe it would be a little broken, but I always thought it would be really cool if you could use it to disarm more enemies than you can. That being said, everything about the puzzles for all of these dungeons were generally really good, but this one in particular, I just remember just being very fun. And there's this like basement level of like zombie bokoblins. They're called cursed bokoblins, but they're basically zombies. And it's like this like graveyard where there's like all these bones on the ground. I just thought that was so cool. You had a lot of time trial things in this one as well, where like there'd be like spinning cylinders of vines, and you'd have to like jump on them at a certain time. Nothing too groundbreaking or anything like that. Speaking of bokoblins, something I was thinking about when I was researching for this episode was I like how The Legend of Zelda has a consistency of using the same villains or the same overworld enemies, but they redesign them based on the overall aesthetic, which I believe I've used that word a lot in this episode alone, but based on the kind of art style of the particular Zelda game, they change the way the enemies look. If you look at the bokoblins in Skyward Sword and then look at them in Breath of the Wild, both of them belong in their respective games as well as the universe, but don't necessarily look alike, and I just thought that was very interesting. Zelda's not the only franchise to do that. I know there's a lot of video game franchises that do that sort of thing. Final Fantasy is one that comes to mind where a lot of the enemies, in each game, or the summonings in each game, even though they'll be called the same name, they'll look inherently different. But it's to kind of contrast that with another Nintendo title. In Mario, a Goomba is a Goomba is a Goomba. They literally do not change the Goomba from game to game. Yes, there was a switch from, the 16-bit or the 8-bit to like the CG or the 3D polygonal, versions of Mario, but none of that stuff changed. The Mario universe in general, nothing really changes. Everything stays the same. And I think maybe that franchise could do for a little reimagining. And, I know it's Nintendo's bell cow. It's Mario is almost as, recognizable as Mickey or Pikachu. It's on that level, so maybe I understand it a little more from that, that point of view. But like Zelda, like the enemies, unless it's a direct sequel, like Majora's Mask used like the same overworld and the same engine, so that was a little different. But yeah, every Zelda game just changes the aesthetic, and I think that's so cool. Even Link himself changes from game to game, although it technically is a different Link in each game, so that makes a lot of sense. But I just thought that was really interesting to bring up, and I think it's really neat that they do that. But another thing from this temple that I thought was really cool that I found out when I was researching it was it now, the Zelda wiki says it appears to be, so I don't know if this was ever confirmed by, someone who wrote for the game or whatever, but I guess it appears to be based on a short story called The Spider's Thread, where, Buddha is walking around and he peers into this pond and down into hell, and, there's a criminal there, and he finds out that the criminal once intentionally did not step on a spider. So Buddha thinks, that's an act of kindness. This person deserves a second chance. And I don't know if there's like a thing between Buddha and spiders, like there's some sort of connection that I wasn't aware of. But he throws down a spider web and the criminal crawls up. And then all of the other sinners start to crawl up the spider web as well. And he goes, he had a name, but it was some, his name wasn't Mark or anything. I didn't write down his name. It started with a K, but all these other sinners are climbing up the web, and he goes, "No, this is my web," and he fends them off, and the web gets weaker and it breaks, and his selfishness basically broke his only escape instead of letting all of the other sinners out with him. And I don't necessarily know what the moral to that story was supposed to be. If that was supposed to be another test for him or what. Also, I don't know why Buddha was just kind of walking around. Oh, maybe it's because Buddha has the multiple arms. Maybe that's kind of the connection to spiders. I feel like I have to look that up now. I wouldn't say I'm overly cultured. I went through the same American school system that everybody else did here, but I'm not, when it comes to worldly religions, I'm not overly knowledgeable. So that's actually something I'm pushed to look up now. I think that's very interesting. Moving on to the Sandship. I think the pirate motif was cool. You meet this ancient robot that has like a mustache and a pirate hat, and it's just really funny. It's like one of those like funny little charming Zelda things. And you have to go through the effort of going to all these like little ports in the desert and finding the damn ship, and then you find the ship, and the ship itself is the dungeon. And I just the downside to this dungeon is it was basically the Lanayru desert mining facility all over again. It was the same aesthetic, the same type of puzzles. They didn't really differentiate it, and I'm not saying, like, aside from the fact that it's versus, like, it's kind of like a ancient, temple / mining facility versus a pirate ship. I understand that's a change, and it does look more like a pirate ship, but I'm just saying, you're still using the time shift stones to solve the same type of puzzles with the same type of enemies, and it all had the same color scheme that it did in the other mining facility. It didn't really stand out in the way I wanted it to, or it could have. Now, it does. So you use the time shift stones to eventually free the pirate crew, and you do use the time shift stones in a neat way. Like, there's sometimes where you're in so there's the outside of the ship, which is more or less a separate, loading screen to get in and out of the ship. But then when you're like in the bowels of the ship, you can shoot through the grates into the time shift stone that's, in the central mass to activate it. And I just thought that the puzzles were really neat. It wasn't the, design of the rooms or the puzzles. It was just, the motif, the overall art style was just too similar to that other temple where it didn't stand out, unfortunately. And this is another area where it fell flat, was the boss. So getting to the boss was more exciting than the boss himself, because you start seeing, like, you think you're going to be battling this, like, kraken. All these, like, tentacles are coming through the ship. You have to escape before you fall underwater. It was really cool. Then you get to the boss, and it was just kind of lame. He's just this big purple blob with, like, I guess Medusa hair. Like, if Medusa were this big, weird eyeball-looking monster out in the sea. I don't know. I was expecting something maybe a bit more detailed, considering the other bosses. Oh my god, I forgot to talk about something. All right, hang on. Pausing this. Going back to the ancient Cistern. I forgot that was my favorite boss battle of the game. I forgot to write it down here. I apologize. I just got kind of caught off track. So at the end of the ancient Cistern, you battle basically a Buddha. He has 6 arms and these giant swords, and you have to, like, use the whip on him to, like, take swords, and then you have to use those giant swords against him. That was the most memorable boss battle to me. That was, like, just such a really cool, fun boss battle. I had a lot of fun doing that. Like, if I could replay one, it would be that one. So I didn't want to skip over that. I just thought of it. I don't know why I didn't write it down. I'm just not very good at this, I guess. Sorry, guys. I don't know why you're listening. Going back to the Sandship, this boss, the boss following that, my favorite, is, like, the worst. The mini boss on this was more fun. So you have to fight kind of this pirate-like Staphos, like this pirate-like robotic Staphos, and you have to kind of, like, it's kind of like your classic, like, Peter Pan versus Captain Hook moment, where you have to fight him on the mast. You're trying to get him to fall off the other side, and that was so much fun. And then the main boss was just this dumb purple tentacle thing. It was just really dumb. Sorry, developers who worked really, really, really hard on this game. That boss, it wasn't even like, if it was just designed better, like more detailed or something, it just would have been, it was just a giant purple blob with an eyeball. There's nothing to it. Anyways, moving on. So unfortunately, I didn't have much to say about the Sandship, except that, pirates are neat. I thought that was a really neat and clever idea, but it just overall fell flat, unfortunately. And then you get to the Fire Sanctuary, where, again, and I said 5 of the 7 were very unique, and 2 of them weren't. The Fire Sanctuary more or less feels exactly like the Earth Temple, where it's like the fire motif. And this one, I will say no, you know what? I'm not going to give them that much credit. I was going to say they changed it up more than they did with the pirate ship, but no, it really just felt like the Earth Temple again. You had lava everywhere, and you had to solve puzzles using the lava and get around the lava. The first thing you see when you get in are owl statues, which I thought were adorable, though. But yeah, you get to upgrade the digging mitts into magma mitts, so you can travel underground in this one. And this is the only time in the game you know, I don't want to say I was creeped out. I think that is kind of a exaggeration, but you dig down into these tunnels and there are these like centipede monsters, and I don't know if it's just because I was confined to these like tiny corridors and it was from a top down perspective, but I was just like, oh god, I don't know what these things are gonna do, but if they get me, I'm screwed. I was very careful around them. Nothing was necessarily overly challenging. The most challenging thing in this temple I think there was an invisible wall that I was told about, and that led to like the other part of the dungeon. I thought that was really neat. Um, you had to use these like water ball plants to like drop water droplets into the lava, which would make little stone things. So that was pretty neat. Um, oh, something I thought about when I was researching this temple was in several instances throughout the game, as well as in this temple, there are these little Hylian crest things on the wall, and you have to use your skyward strike on them, and then you have to draw whatever. And I never really knew what to draw. I always just tried to draw the bird, like the Hylian symbol, and sometimes a lot of hearts would pop out, sometimes 3 hearts would pop out. I guess if you draw a diamond, rubies pop out, and I didn't know that. I wish I had known the different things you could draw on those before I did the game, but there wasn't really anything in the game that necessarily told you what you could do, or there wasn't, I just didn't see it. The boss of the temple is Girahim, and this is the last temple that features him. So I guess there was only 2 temples that featured Girahim, but it's not the last time you fight him in the game. Girahim, I did have mixed feelings about, and I went into a lot of him in the last episode. Battling him felt like you felt the weight of how hard it was to fight him, because it didn't seem like anything was really doing any damage. It always felt like he was toying with you, and he had such this oppressive presence when you fought him. It reminded me a lot of the movie It Follows. And if you haven't seen the movie It Follows, if you're into horror movies, I definitely recommend it. It's not your generic, and I don't know how many people I'm gonna upset here, but I think the Paranormal Activity movies are stupid. It's not like those where it's just a bunch of dumb jump scares. It's actually more of like a well-written movie, a really cool general premise. I don't want to ruin too much, but the main villains in the movie are these people that just and they can resemble any number of people you know, people you don't know, and they just walk towards you at a slow pace, and they're never yielding. And that's how Girahim made me feel. He was just always walking towards you. It didn't look like you could defeat him, and even though you do eventually, it was generally difficult, and it you did feel the weight of it. You know, Demon Lord in the end did feel like a decently hard villain as well. I did die a couple times fighting him, but I thought for kind of a subservient boss, Girahim did just fine. I was generally thrown off at the fact of like every time I saw him and I'm like, oh crap, I'm gonna have to fight him. Like I was generally worried, like, oh, I wonder if I'm gonna be able to pull this off. So I love, and even though I pulled it off fine, I do like that feeling. I like that challenge. Moving on to the final temple, which was the most interesting temple in the game, Skykeep. So Skykeep exists in sort of like that goddess statue area. You have to do this little puzzle to open it up, and there's a whole bunch of stuff you do beforehand where you have to like learn the song of the hero, and you have to go all around. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that in the next episode. But you get to the Skykeep, and it's like 8 different rooms, and you use these terminals to adjust where the rooms are. Like you slide them around, and each one is reminiscent of a temple you've already been to. And you're trying to get the 3 pieces of the Triforce with these rooms, and you get the dungeon map almost instantly, so you know which 3 rooms have the Triforce in them. It reminded me, now going back and relooking at it, it reminds me of the recent Link Awakening trailer we got at E3, where you had this like new kind of mini game dungeon creator where you could create different rooms in the dungeons and stuff like that. And I'm wondering if Skyward Sword had somewhat of a inspiration on that. That was 8 years ago, so I doubt it, but I do think that there's a really interesting correlation there. You know, this was a generally difficult temple. I really enjoyed this. There was nothing to write home about as far as each individual room. It was just solving different puzzles. I remember the one that was reminiscent of the Earth Temple. I don't really remember why, but I remember it took me a while. I think it was probably, again, I always get tripped up at the really easy things, but generally this was just really fun. Each room was, because it was just one room, so you knew it was compact, but there was so much to do in that one room, and there was multiple like layers and levels to it. Also, the pirate Staphos made the return, and I think he had kind of a different form in this, like kind of a different one, but he made his return. He was kind of a ghost pirate in this one, so that was really cool. And just, I thought that was like just one of the most interesting things the game did, was this whole like, find the Triforce in these dungeons. You have to move around the dungeons to figure out how to get to each one. I tried to move them around so I was getting the Triforce easier and more immediately, and it was just really awesome to do that. That was like a kind of a good, you can call it a temple. That is what it is. Even though it took from every other temple aesthetic wise. There you go again, using that word. But it was probably the second most memorable for me, just because the ancient temple with the Buddha was the most memorable for me, but this one is definitely a very close second. One of the most unique temples I ever did in a Zelda game, so I thought that was really cool. Even if I don't have anything like overly interesting to say about the rooms individual, it's just like the overall concept was just really neat. And that's all of the temples, and I thought it was very important for me to go over them, not only because I failed to completely in the last episode, but I was so negative in the last episode, and I thought it was very stupid of me, really, or I felt really stupid overlooking possibly the greatest strength of the game, which was the unique puzzle design. They really went above and beyond in these dungeons. Like, the dungeons in Skyward Sword were way better than the ones in Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild opted for 120 shrines that were all like mini puzzles, and then they had the 4 divine beasts, which all looked exactly the same. And that is like my only negative thing I really have to say about Breath of the Wild. That, and maybe the overall story was just sort of good. This game nailed both of those, though. It's like everything that Breath of the Wild fixed about Skyward Sword, for all the issues I had about Skyward Sword, that Breath of the Wild just nailed out of the park. It lost a little bit of the things that Skyward Sword did the greatest or the best at, and I'm hoping that Breath of the Wild 2 harks back to that origin. I know they are. I know they're going to go back to that original dungeon design, because I'm sure they heard everybody talking about it. I've seen reports that they put out, little tidbits about like, job openings for dungeon designers. So I'm very excited to see what they do with that game, with both the story and the dungeon design, and we'll see if they still include the shrines or if they don't. So that'll be very interesting. So next week I'm gonna go more into the general areas of Skyward Sword and my thoughts on each one of them, and a little bit more on how the game might connect to future games. As well as I'm gonna be trying to play some more not Hyrule Warriors. It's oh geez. Oh, the new game that came out for the Switch, the one where you're like Dance of the Necromancer. Oh geez. I can't think of the name. I'm not even going to cut this out of the podcast. This is so embarrassing. New Zelda. I'm typing this into Google right now. New Zelda Switch game. Which one is it? Oh, I just remembered it. Cadence of Hyrule. It also popped up as I remembered it. But Cadence of Hyrule. I'm going to try to play Cadence of Hyrule more this week. And I might end up talking about my thoughts on that in the next episode, because it doesn't really, I don't believe it's being included in the overall Hyrule continuity. I'll keep checking the Japanese version of the Zelda website to check, but I believe especially because it's made from a different developer and it's kind of this like Elseworlds tale, I don't believe it's actually connecting to any straight Zelda continuity. But I've played it a little, and I want to get more into it this week, among the other games I'm playing. But that's it for today. Thank you for joining me. If there's anything in particular you think I missed so far about Skyward Sword, or anything you want to comment on, feel free to tweet at me at Hylian Andy on Twitter, or email me at hylianandy@gmail.com. And remember to catch the Manabar video game podcast every Thursday at noon. We have a neat episode this week where we're going to be talking a lot about multiplayer games and our favorites from that. And with that, it's dangerous to go alone. Take this.